היי לכולם. רק מי שאין לו תמונה, תשימו תמונה מי שיכול, כדי שהיא תוכל לראות תמונות של אנשים. וגם רציתי לבקש מכם שאם יש לכם משהו לשאול, אני אשים בצ'אט את המייל שלי, אתם יכולים לשלוח לי שאלות ואני מעבירה לה את זה בצורה מרוכזת, ככה היא ביקשה. אז היא תיתן לזה זמן כל שיעור לעשות את זה. דבר נוסף, בדף מורה אנחנו נשים את כל בעצם הדפים שהיא תשלח לנו, ואנחנו גם נשים שם קישור ליוטיוב, ככה שתוכלו ישר להיכנס לערוץ שלה, ולא להתחיל לחפש ערוצים אחרים. אז זהו. היי גשמה.
Hi. Hi again. Hi.
Do you want to wait 2 minutes or we can start?
Let's wait 1 minute. It's yeah, 1 more minute.
Okay, so I will
Before.
put my email that if people want to send some question, so they can
Please.
do it.
Yes,
So
go ahead.
You are now co-host, so you can share your file now.
You want to say something about the questions?
No, I just say that I made you a co-host, so you can share your file now.
Okay.
I think that we can start, so.
I'll start, right? I mean, anyway, you're starting with the prayers being shared, right? After the meditation. So
Yeah.
I won't start sharing before that. Okay, great. So let's start, as usual, with some meditation and a prayer. First, some breathing meditation. Now visualize in the space in front of you a large open lotus, on top of which is a sun disk and a moon disk. And on those is your own Lama, who appears in the aspect of Buddha Shakyamuni. The Buddha's body is made of clear light and wears the robes of a monk. He's seated in the full lotus posture. His right hand is in the earth-touching gesture, and his left hand is resting in his lap in a meditation gesture, holding a begging bowl. Now remember, Buddha is same nature as your Lama or your Lamas. And then think that you're also surrounded by all sentient beings, all of who arise or appear in the form of a human being. The nature of their mind being the same as the nature of the mind of the Buddha. Yet temporarily their mind is obstructed by their root ignorance and all the other afflictive emotions. And so first generate affectionate love, feeling of acceptance, closeness, and affection towards each and every one, sentient beings surrounding you. And then focusing specifically on different types of their suffering, generate great compassion. That is the wish for all of them, without exception, to be free from any type of suffering, with the aspiration, may I be able to protect them, help them to free themselves from all their suffering. Which then gives way to the altruistic attitude, which is the determination to do whatever is necessary, however long it may take, to work towards liberating sentient beings from all their suffering, liberate all sentient beings from their suffering. And since we right now are not able to help all sentient beings, not even able to help one person or even ourselves, let's generate the aspiration to become fully enlightened, so that then we can perfectly help sentient beings, lead them towards liberation or enlightenment. And think also that it's with this motivation, with the force of bodhicitta, I will study the fundamental wisdom Again, for the benefit of all sentient beings. And then without letting go of our motivation, still visualizing the Buddha in the space in front of us, let's recite the prayer. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits, practicing generosity, and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Okay, let me just share the screen. Just a sec. All right. Can you see the Lamrim outlines? Great. Okay. Now, as I said last time, we'll start every time with the Lamrim. Last class, I asked you for this last week to meditate on the first 4 points or the first 4 freedoms, as mentioned here. So to meditate on the fact that we have a life, we have a human life without experiencing this incredible pain and fear of a hellish existence, or the continual grasping and clinging of a preta existence, or we don't live like animals, or we are no animals. And of course, we are not celestial beings or live, if you like a celestial being, without any interest other than interest in luxury and so forth. So for this week, I'd like you to reflect on the next points, the next 4, which are here described. While we don't live like barbarians among uncivilized savages, or in a country where religion was outlawed. So in particular, with regard to the Dharma, and of course you all know that it's not necessary to be a Buddhist to become a Buddhist, but at least we have the teachings of the Buddha available, and we can choose to practice the Dharma or not. We have that freedom. However, if we were to live in a country, well, in a barbaric country, whatever that means, where would not be interested at all in any kind of spiritual development. So if we were only interested in material development, we had no access to religion, where religion was outlawed. I mean, there are countries where if you're practicing Buddhist, you could be imprisoned or killed. Which reminds me of something Geshe Damdra, who used to be His Holiness's translator. He once told me about when he was still translating for His Holiness, he went to a country, and never mind the country, but in that country there was a very important person, very famous, very wealthy, had great power, but could not publicly admit that he had an interest in the Dharma. And so he had to secretly meet with His Holiness to get some teachings. And so despite his status, despite all the opportunities he was not free to practice the Dharma. And so that would be an example of someone who doesn't have the same freedom that we have. Also, we're not somewhere where the Buddhist teachings are unavailable, where a Buddha hasn't appeared, so at a different time, or maybe in a different world systems, which, of course, according to Buddhism, there's so many different world systems, and they're worlds just like ours. But in those, maybe a Buddha hasn't come yet. There are no Buddha's teachings. There's no religion available at all. So that we're free from that. We have access to the 2 points, the past 2 points. We have access to a type of spiritual system like Buddhism, where we can practice, we can transform our mind. Thirdly, we're not mentally retarded. I mean, we don't have any mental problems to such a degree. I mean, we all have mental problems, but not to such a degree that we're unable to practice. We're unable to meditate, think about bodhicitta, emptiness, reflect on it, internalize it, and so forth. Deaf, dumb, and blind. I mean, well, that's not necessarily an obstacle, but of course, in some cases it can be. So therefore, the worst impairment would be mental impairments. And also, we don't hold strong, wrong views, such that we believe, well, any kind of religion is just poison, materialistic worldview, that's the only worthwhile view, and so forth. And so in that context, so if you reflect on this for this coming week, as you did last time, but more on those 4 points here, and of course you can be creative with them, whatever in relation to those comes to mind. But something else I also thought of in relation to those 4, for instance, we're not imprisoned. We don't think so much about people who are imprisoned, I guess. They're not really that present, I guess, in our daily life. But, well, certain people being imprisoned for many years maybe don't have the access to the Dharma, depending on what prison they're in, or people with addictions, drug addiction, alcohol addictions, and so forth, which they're not able to control. And it's a sickness, of course. And so therefore, being so sick that, again, not being able to practice the Dharma. Again, to reflect on this, how fortunate we are that at this point we have the opportunity, we have access, and are not affected by these 4 points here. So we're free from these 4 points. So really make an effort and find that sense of joy or satisfaction that, well, we have this incredible opportunity. And so, well, we'll come to that later, that we shouldn't waste it, but it's already going in that direction, of course. Okay, so that's for next week. For this coming week, really. If you please take some time out of your probably very busy schedule, reflect on those 4 points, rejoice, have a sense of, well, gratitude, appreciation, and to rejoice about your situation. And of course, I would suggest that you also read the Lamrim Chenmo, that is the great treatise of the stages to the path to enlightenment, that has been translated by Lama Tsongkhapa, those 3 volumes. I think they're actually available online, even for free. I've seen them there. But anyway, if you've got the books, that's great. And also something I can recommend is Geshe Sopa's commentary on this particular text by Lama Tsongkhapa, this Lamrim text. I think there are 5 volumes. And so if you want to deepen your understanding, especially of these 4 types of freedom, then please try to get the first volume of this particular book by Geshe Sopa. Forget what it's called now. Let me just check, what is it called? Steps on the Path to Enlightenment. Steps on the Path to Enlightenment. Very good commentary on the Lamrim, probably the most extensive commentary. Okay. And then I've received 2 questions Can you see the questions? Can you see the question? Okay, great. All right, so there are two questions, not three, two questions. So from now on, since it's so easy sharing the screen, might as well just, read the questions to you while you can actually read them yourself. So the first one is from Ariella. She asked for me to expound on nihilism. Okay, so, well, nihilism, as I mentioned last time, is the extreme of non-existence. And, well, depending on how you define nihilism, whether it's the view of nihilism or whether you describe nihilism as the view of nihilism or you describe the non-existence itself. But anyway, talking about the view on nihilism, the view of nihilism, that is a kind of attitude that believes that something which doesn't exist, which does exist, something that actually exists, that conventionally exists, is non-existent. Okay, so to define nihilism, or the view of the view of nihilism, well, perceiving something that does exist to not exist. But in what way is that important? In what way? Why is it mentioned in the context of emptiness? Well, of course, usually our misperception, our ignorance is a mind that adds to what's actually there, has a sense that phenomena are more concrete than they actually are. But the problem is that we can fall, and one thing besides that. So although in general we have the view that nothing exists, we have a view that everything exists inherently, but with regard to certain ideas, we also deny the existence of other things. So for instance, we may deny the law of cause and effect, or the law of not just the law of cause and effect, but the law of karma. And there are plenty of people in this world who have a sense that their actions don't have consequences. I mean, I'm not talking about the Jewish or Christian or Muslim view that God will punish us, for instance, to put it simply. I'm talking about in general, the sense I can do whatever I want, my actions won't have consequences. That is, unless I get caught by other human beings and so get in prison, for whatever I've done. But in general, my actions don't have consequences. That would be an example of the view of nihilism with regard to the law of karma and its effects. Okay. But nihilism, in the sense that I believe nothing exists, I don't think, and there's some debate on that, but it doesn't really make sense that there's someone who doesn't believe there's anything. It's more to do with, in the context of emptiness, I mentioned it a few moments ago. So in the context of emptiness, when we deny, when we refute, or when the text, I should say, Nagarjuna in his fundamental wisdom, for instance, negates inherent existence, well, then we may fall to the extreme, say, for instance, taking the I, the self. If an inherent existence I is refuted, well, we may have a sense there's no I whatsoever. And I mentioned it last time as part of the handout that I read, that for us, an inherently existent I is the same as an existent I. There's no difference to us. For us, whatever appears to be inherently existent. Our mind at this point cannot separate, has not learned to separate an inherently existent self and a conventional existent self. Those two, since we can't separate them, if you deny one, if you refute an inherently existent self, that seems to be the same as refuting the self. And it's very interesting. Whenever, in particular, I teach, and I'm not the only one, whoever teaches the Dharma or whoever gives classes on the Dharma, when they talk about selflessness, it doesn't matter initially when this idea is introduced, it doesn't matter how much you insist there is a self, it just doesn't exist inherently. In the beginning, there's always this reaction, there's always this kind of comment, it always comes from the audience saying, well, since the self doesn't exist. And so it's again and again saying, well, since there's no I, but so we keep emphasizing, but there is an I. Of course, there is an I. It just doesn't exist the way it appears to us. So that shows, especially initially, people who hear about lack of inherent existence and so forth, with regard to the self in this case, right away have a sense, oh, then there's nothing. There can't be a self. Okay. So in that context, with regard to the self, we fall into the extreme of nihilism. In that particular situation, I'm not saying we get up from class and we do some other things and suddenly we feel there's nothing there. I don't think that's realistic. I mean, things still appear to us. We may mentally feel, oh, they're not really there, I'm just imagining it. But if you have the sense, I'm just imagining it, I'm just thinking it's there, well, at least the thinking is there. There's a mind, you feel there's a mind that thinks there's nothing there. Therefore, you never have a sense there's really nothing there. Anyway, I that's my opinion. I don't think you can fall into an extreme of nihilism with regard to everything, that you deny the existence of anything. I don't think that happens. But in the context of looking up the emptiness of a particular phenomenon, yes, you can fall into that extreme. And it's not like you're stuck. I mean, you can get stuck for some time, but it's really most dangerous when there's a sense there's no law of cause and effect, or no law of karma and its effect. All right, we only have time for one question today. I'll answer the next one next time because Jimmy's question is a little bit longer. All right, so let's go back to the material. Okay, I practiced this before. I should be able to do this. Yes, here it is. Excuse me. So this is the handout from last time. I meant to add 3 pages. I ended up adding 6 pages, so it became much longer. Also, it's changed slightly. You still have the old one from last class, and here's the new version. Now, I don't need to read through this again. It's pretty much stayed the same with regard to emptiness. And anyway, having gone through it last time, well, that should be enough, simply because the whole text deals with emptiness, of course. The entire fundamental wisdom, it's all about negating. Of course, dependent arising is mentioned. Dependent arising is a huge subject, but it is not as extensively explained as emptiness, which is why there's no need to, as an introduction to the subject matter, to go more into emptiness now. I'd rather go through dependent arising. Now, what I started to do, and you've probably noticed if you're part of the WhatsApp group for this class, that I prepare the material in advance. That is, I try to get it to you at the weekend. Well, whatever your weekend means, whether it's Friday or Saturday. So usually around Saturday. So I try to get the material to around Saturday. It's going to be put on the Dharma Friends website, as well as, I mean, Dalit very kindly puts it into the Dharma Friends website and posts it in the WhatsApp group, which gives you the opportunity to read it in advance. Wait just one second. I thought there was a question, but there's not. To read it in advance. It's always easier to read it in advance if you've got the time, or at least if you don't have the time to do that, well, then you can use your own computer if you have a hard time following Zoom. Anyway, okay, so we'll just go through this together, just explaining dependent arising. I've basically, whatever I've learned about dependent arising, I've tried to put it into this particular handout. And I've also added some illustrations just for you to visualize certain aspects, or to get a better sense of certain concepts and hopefully remember them better. Okay. Anyway, first, I explained the Tibetan term for dependent arising. Tendil is the shorter version, or Pratitya Samutpada, the Sanskrit. But it's actually an abbreviated form. And here I'm not explaining the Sanskrit, which is pretty much very similar, basically, but the Tibetan, which of course I'm more familiar with. So the Tibetan term is Tenjin Dewa Jungwa. So it's actually a really long word, a long term, well, more than one word, it's a few words. And because it's not easily translated, just it's the nature of this particular term. So ten means depend, jing, and connect. Dewa means connect, relate, pertain to, jungwa, to rise, come forth, occur, originate. All right. So those are it's just the meaning of each word. And therefore this term can be translated, and you have to add some brackets, because in Tibetan it makes perfect sense without adding as a phenomenon, but in English you would have to add it. So that which arises as a phenomenon that is connected and dependent on other phenomena. Okay, so a dependent arising, something that is dependently arisen, is something that exists, that is implied by the term Dendel or Denjindo or Jungwa. So it's something that exists and that is connected and dependent on other phenomena. And that is usually therefore translated as dependent arising or dependent origination. So phenomena exist, they only exist because they're dependent. That is, they're connected to and dependent on many, many other things. Okay. So taking the example of a flower, for instance, there are many different phenomena, numerous phenomena that a flower is connected to and that it depends on, and which are responsible. So all these phenomena are responsible for the existence of the flower. And these phenomena can be classified into three categories: causes and conditions, parts, and designation by name and thought. All right, many of you are familiar with this, but just in case you're not, well, here it is again. So, or here it is, this is the most basic kind of explanation. So this means, therefore, there are three levels of dependent arising on dependence on causes and conditions, on parts, and on designation by name and thought, which will be explained, of course. So reflection on these three levels of dependent arising is considered indispensable, vital, to avoid the extreme of nihilism. Okay, to avoid the sense, well, if the I doesn't exist inherently, doesn't exist at all, there is no I. Okay, so if we reflect on dependent arising, we can avoid this. And when we subject phenomena to ultimate analysis, I mentioned that last time. So when we search for a phenomenon's inherent nature, there is the danger that we may cultivate the wrong idea that since phenomena cannot be found under such analysis, they do not exist, right? So under such analysis, they cannot be found. And therefore we may think, well, since under such analysis they cannot be found, they don't exist at all. But that's where the mistake lies. It's only in relation to this analysis that they cannot be found. But in relation to something else, they do exist, which is why we say they exist. And so contemplating dependent arising helps us to overcome such a wrong view and facilitates the realization of how phenomena do exist. But not just that. So not only does it help us to understand that refuting inherent existence of the self doesn't mean there's no self. So it helps us to overcome that other extreme, that the self or any other phenomenon doesn't exist at all. But the understanding of dependent arising also promotes the understanding of emptiness. While the understanding of emptiness also promotes the understanding of dependent arising. So these two are dependent on each other. Understanding of emptiness and understanding of dependent arising. They're mutually dependent. Another example of two things that are, well, dependent on each other. Because, well, as I said, the understanding of dependent arising helps us to understand emptiness better, and understanding emptiness also helps us to understand dependent arising better. Usually we think of the first scenario, dependent arising helps to realize emptiness, but actually also the understanding of emptiness can also help to understand dependent arising, at least on the subtlest level. Because to understand the subtlest level of dependent arising, first we must realize emptiness. Anyway, Okay, so just mentioning that, and of course, there'll be more on this. But let's go through the 3 types of dependent arising. And one more thing, this is now a lot of material that I prepared. Well, it's 10 pages, not exactly 9.5 pages. In the future, there won't be that much. We pretty much go through the text. So you have the text, of course, but I keep it shorter. I keep these handouts shorter. But as I mentioned before, I feel it's important just to ease you into the material to get some kind of understanding, especially on dependent arising, because as I said, the text doesn't mention dependent arising as much as emptiness. So dependence on causes and conditions. This is the coarsest of the 3 levels of dependent arising because it's easier to understand. Coarse and subtle. This idea of coarse and subtle comes up a lot in Buddhism. And it usually means, coarse means easier understood. Subtle means harder to understand. Okay? We talk about coarse consciousness, a coarser type of consciousness, and a subtler type of consciousness. Well, coarser type of consciousness means it's easier for us to be aware of that type of consciousness, to recognize that kind of consciousness. Subtler consciousness, when it arises, we're not even necessarily aware of it. Coarse anger, we're aware of our coarse anger. Subtler anger, we maybe not aware at all that there's actually a form of anger present. So just for you to remember, when you hear words such as coarse and subtle, how can you differentiate? Well, that which is easier understood is always described in most cases, or yes, I guess you could say always coarser, whereas if it's harder to understand, then it's described as subtler. Therefore, the first level is easier understood. It only applies to phenomena that are changing all the time, so impermanent phenomena, because permanent phenomena are not generated in dependence on causes and conditions. Okay, so for example, take a sprout. A sprout, that's the classic example from a seed. You have a seedling or a sprout. It exists because it's a dependently risen phenomenon that was produced by many causes, by numerous causes and conditions, like a seed, soil, water, the sun, and so forth. So you need many causes and conditions for, think of a seed, visualize a seed that gives rise to a sprout. Okay, and we'll have a picture in just shortly. There's an illustration of that. But yeah, for now, many causes and conditions are needed for an impermanent phenomenon to come into existence. And this understanding of this level of dependence also promotes the understanding of emptiness. Now, let me pause here. Just one thing I want to say, which is this. Not only does this understanding, this level of dependence, also help us to understand emptiness, but even without going into emptiness, and I didn't mention what I'm going to say now, didn't mention this in this handout because it's strictly in relation to emptiness. But if you think, even in relation to reducing other afflictive emotions, I'm saying other than ignorance. Okay, so ignorance with regard to inherent existence. So leaving that aside, and this is what we're dealing with here, trying to reduce this ignorance. No, but just ordinary afflictive emotions, such as anger, can be reduced if we simply meditate on, familiarize ourselves with the dependence on causes and conditions. It's a very simple example. If you feel extremely angry about someone having done something terrible, all right? In other classes, I've given this example of a murderer who's killed a lot of people. So when you hear this, there's this sense, there's this evil person. We may not rationally think this is an evil person, but there's a deep sense this is just an evil person. It's more an emotional reaction to this terrible person. And there's a sense of resentment and possibly anger and maybe even hatred, depending on who they killed. And so if then someone describes us the upbringing of that person, of that murderer, how they were tortured, how they were victims of incredible abuse at home, sexual abuse, violence and so forth, right away, that sense of dislike and hatred, can you feel how it almost melts away? The sense of, oh, this is where this comes from. So our anger and our hatred are no longer as strong as they were before, because there's the sense of dependence on causes and conditions. And a sense, well, if I had been brought up in such an environment, would I know for sure? Can I know for sure I wouldn't have become that kind of murderer? And instead of this hatred, well, compassion can actually set in. So it's an interesting phenomenon. Every time, I guess, we hear about, and that doesn't mean, of course, we're not saying that this person shouldn't be disciplined, shouldn't be punished, shouldn't be imprisoned, and so forth. It's not about that, but it's about reducing our anger and so forth. So it shows dependence on causes and conditions. It not only deals with our misperception of reality on an even deeper level, but it also deals with our anger and our hatred and so forth that we sometimes have, or just simple resentment. Okay. Anyway, going back to emptiness, this understanding promotes the understanding of emptiness, the understanding of this level of dependence. And if we reflect on this type of dependence, we come to see that because owing to the sprout's dependence on causes and conditions, the sprout cannot exist inherently and from its own side, which really saying inherently exists, it's already a sprout in and of itself. It doesn't need anything else. It's by its nature, it is a sprout. Well, that is impossible if it depends on causes and conditions. Because if something did exist that way, like I said, like if it existed through its own power and so forth, it would be independent of the phenomena. So that is, I guess, pretty straightforward. But if then the contemplation of the dependence on causes and conditions is taken to a subtler level of ultimate analysis, we can also come to see that despite our sense, so even though we feel there's a truly existent first moment of the sprout, and this is what's so interesting, because dependent arising, you know, when we talk about dependence, in everyday life, we talk much more about dependent existence. Here it's about how does something come into existence, about arising. So dependent arising. How does it come into existence? Independence on other phenomena. And then, of course, it also exists in dependence on other phenomena. So in Buddhism, how does something come into existence? That is very much emphasized. And if something like the sprout comes into existence, a sprout, a seedling comes into existence, there must be a moment, there must be a time when it comes into existence. There's a time when it wasn't there, and then there's a time when it is there. Makes sense. It's logical. But what is that first moment? It's impossible to find that moment. Okay? If there's no, so despite our sense, there's a truly existent first moment of the sprout, it's impossible to find that moment. It's not possible to determine the very moment when the cause of the sprout, the seed is the cause of the sprout. Okay, so here you have an example of a seed. Okay, so here are 8 moments. Of course, you can go endlessly and divide this in further moments, but that's all I could find online. Like I told you last time, I'm using an app where I can copy paste pictures, and I could only find these 8 moments. But anyway, when is the exact moment that this little thing here, this bean, actually, well, I could find cannabis seeds and I could find these seeds. So I decided I use the beans. So the beans, when this is still called a seed, and then a sprout. When is that exact moment? Is it that moment or any moment in between? When is that exact moment? I mean, you can subdivide this. Each moment consists of endless other moments, okay? Even shorter moments. And so when is it exactly? When was that first moment? It's not possible to determine the very moment when the cause of the sprout ceases. It's no longer a seed. It's no longer a cause of the sprout, but it is now a sprout. When is that exact moment? One reason why is it difficult to define a sprout? One reason that it's difficult is that it is difficult to define a sprout in such a way that it is clear, especially on a subtle level, whether a phenomenon is no longer a seed or a sprout, right? It's very difficult. Are you calling this a seed or a sprout? We're all going to be in disagreement on this. Some would say, no, this is still a seed. Some would say, no, this is already a sprout. Some would say, no, this is the sprout. Okay, we all be in disagreement on this. If you were to be able to see all these different moments, like on a photograph, for instance, or in a film, when is the exact moment? We couldn't agree on that. That's one reason. Just by conventionally, very difficult to determine, right? And here you're getting engaging in this kind of analysis. When is the first moment of a sprout? When is it still a seed? Very difficult. That's one reason why it's difficult to determine the first moment of a sprout, just by convention. But another reason is that there's no smallest moment in time. That every moment, you have an hour that can be divided. And here, moment, we think of moments usually in terms of very short moments. But an hour is a moment, just a longer moment. And then that consists of shorter moments. At least the Tibetan word has that connotation. Although in general, when you hear the Tibetan word gechima or gechik, has a sense it's short, but it's all relative. In relation to 1 year, 1 hour is really short. So it's just described as a certain time period, and therefore it's a moment. But it can be divided, of course, into minutes, and those can be divided into seconds, and then you've got nanoseconds, and you can divide it endlessly. We'll have more on this, but anyway, just for now, there's no smallest moment in time. So no matter how brief a moment is, it can be further divided into even smaller moments. So how could you have the one moment, even if we were all to agree that this moment here, this is when it's a sprout, this second moment here, well, that second moment can be endlessly divided. And when is the exact moment then, right? Is it the first part of the second moment? Is it the next part of the second moment? And that part can be again divided. So what previously seemed so clear, you have a sprout. And since you have a sprout, there was a moment when it came into existence. Well, that moment, when is that exactly? Right? Okay. However, if the sprout existed inherently, objectively, by way of its own character, the way it appears to us, there would have to be a smallest moment in time, and we would be able to pinpoint the exact first moment of the sprout. Right? We have a sense, it's very concrete. That's the sense we have. There's a seed first, a sprout next. Seems very, very clear. It seems very well defined and so forth. But the moment we look a little closer in terms of the time when exactly it came into existence, when is it no longer a seed? When is it now a sprout? Things are no longer as concrete as they were before. So it's already showing us, by just reflecting on dependence on causes and conditions, the concreteness, the sense of something being very substantially over there, it starts fading. Okay, so that's just the first type of dependence. And then a slightly deeper level of dependence, a subtler level, since it's harder to understand, is dependence on parts. Okay, dependence on parts. I thought I added a bracket somewhere, because parts, we think of parts, it comes somewhere. I somewhere added a bracket, but I don't remember where now. When we think of parts, we usually think of parts like spatial parts, right? Like, I don't know, if you take, here's a car, used a car, the door, the wheels and so forth. These are the parts of the car. But they're more than just spatial parts, so parts that occupy space. They're also temporal parts, and they're attributes that are a part of the car, certain characteristics. They're functions that a car performs, and therefore it's a part of the car. So anything that exists at the same time as the car, that is a part of the car, is described as part. Okay, so therefore a car is dependent on other phenomena. not causes and conditions which preceded the car, in the case of this example, but, and this is true not just for the cars, for anything, permanent or impermanent, at the very least, it has certain characteristics. So anything has parts and is therefore dependent on their parts. So taking the example of a car has spatial parts, engine, steering wheel, the tires. It has temporal parts, yesterday's car, today's car, tomorrow's car. I mean, on a subatomic level, I mean, obviously the atoms that make up the car, they're changing all the time, which means the car changes, even if this change is not obvious to us. Then it has parts that are its attributes, such as the car's impermanence, its existence, its size, and it performs certain functions that are part of the car. Oh yeah, there it is. So since it is composed of and dependent on those parts, the car exists. Okay, so anything is made up of things that are not itself. Anything. To go back to the murderer, to the serial killer, if you like, and our hatred towards this person. If you take the example, I'm trying to think of something of an interview I once listened to on the BBC about this woman who, I think she had killed her own children and other children. She was extremely violent, and they finally caught her. And this person who spent a lot of time with her in prison, she was eventually executed. She got the death penalty, and so she was executed. But there's this woman who was with her over the years while she was on death row, and she actually talked about how she became close to this killer that so many people hated. And one aspect she talked about was, of course, her difficult upbringing. So they interviewed this lady, and she said, well, this murderer, she was this terrible, cruel person. She did these incredible things. But if you look at her upbringing, and so she had developed this friendship based on, of course, compassion for that person, based on understanding the causes and conditions that gave rise to her. Plus, she said she had many positive qualities. Yes, she was this murderer. She had these, well, she didn't put it in those words, but she had these minds that wanted to kill someone and so forth. Yeah, there was that. But there was also this kindness. So a person is so complicated. A person has so many aspects. Anything has so many aspects. But taking a person in this case, a person is not just their anger. I mean, I don't want to be defined by my anger. I feel I'm a lot more, and I'm sure there's some people who feel, oh, that's just this angry Kelsang Wangmo, can't see anything else. And so in this case of this murderer, this woman, a lot of people saw her as just that, a murderer. But there's a lot more. And again, dependence on parts helps us that anything is much more than just that one aspect. That's just one part, and the person is a lot more. So that again helps us to overcome certain afflictive emotions, or to reduce them, I should say, at least reduce them, such as anger, etc. Anyway, reflecting on this level of dependent arising facilitates the comprehension of emptiness, because the car, let's go back to the car, and it works for any other phenomenon. You can use the car or anything else. Principle is the same. The ideas, the underlying ideas are the same. So despite the car existing in dependence on its parts, if we subject the car to ultimate analysis by searching for some inherent car, a kind of essence or carness among its parts, we will not be able to find it. So based on this premise, based on the understanding that a car is dependent on its parts, well, then if we look for the car, okay, some kind of something, what makes it a car among its parts, where else are you going to look for the car? You can't look for it somewhere else. You look where the car is, you won't be able to find it. In fact, since there's no partless particle, there's no smallest particle in time, in the sense that, partless particle in the sense that any particle, even an atom, can be subdivided into subatomic particles, if not physically, but at least mentally. So there's no smallest car, no smallest moment, no smallest particle that you can say this is the car. Or there's no smallest moment in time. We can mentally take the car apart endlessly without ever finding a car. All right, so you start off here. If you've got a fancy red car, well, start taking it apart, right? And then here it's very orderly, it's all laid out. Where's the car? Okay, so if you do this just thinking about it intellectually, oh yeah, it makes sense. It's not difficult, but if you meditate on it, it's much more potent. It's hard to fathom right away how this can like mentally take apart a car. Who cares? But especially if you're attached to this car, if it's your car, your precious car. And so then you take it apart, and where's that special? What's the special aspect of it? Right? So taking it apart, yeah, taking apart the murderer, right? Where's that evilness? Is it the eye consciousness, the body consciousness? Is it the elbow? Is it this part of the body? Just take apart the person and try to find this evilness. Where's the evil? I'm not saying that this person didn't conventionally do what she did. I'm just saying our sense there's something very concrete, which is evil, which is this, that, and the other. Well, take it apart. Where is it? Okay. So even though we have a sense that there is a car that truly exists in space and time. Okay, so you only have like a car that's taken apart already, but think of your precious, beautiful car that truly exists in space and time. When we take apart the spatial parts, as here, of the car, we are unable to find a car that truly occupies space. When we take apart the attributes of the car, we're unable to find a car that truly possesses those characteristics. Yeah, where is it that owns those, that possesses those characteristics? We say the characteristics of the car. That's how we talk, yes. But let's not be misled by language. Language is very helpful. Otherwise, how do you talk about the car separate from the parts? But it seems to us that on top of just describing a car based on its parts, but there seems to be more than that. To our mind, there seems to be more. Something that truly possesses those characteristics, especially with a person. There's someone who truly possesses body and mind. But when we take apart the spatial parts, when we take apart the temporal parts of the car, we're unable to find a car that truly occupies time. Not just does the car not truly occupy space, it also doesn't truly occupy time. There's no findable past car or future car and present car. Well, we come to that. Regarding the latter, since there's no smallest moment in time, there's no smallest moment, we're unable to pinpoint an ultimately existent present moment of the car. The now. Where's the now? Because every present moment can again be divided into a former present moment. Like if you have it's always a continuum. So there's a former moment, a middling moment, and a later moment, right? And then it can be again divided. It can be again divided. It's like a continuum. And a continuum, any time is always a continuum. And a continuum, by implication, it implies that there's more than one aspect, right? It's like when you have a mala. A continuum, a continuum in time is like a mala with each beat being a moment, right? So just as a mala consists of many moments, a continuum always consists of further moments. So even one short moment is a continuum. It occupies time, and therefore it consists of smaller moments. So it's impossible, therefore, to posit the exact present moment, because you can still take a former moment, a later moment, and a middling moment. So the middling moment is like the present moment. The former is like the past, and the later is the future moment. So where's that exact middling present moment? Not possible to find. Therefore, it is also not possible. It's also not possible either to posit an ultimately existent past and future car. Therefore, it's also not possible either to. Oh, there's a mistake. It's also not possible Either should go. To posit an ultimately existent past and future car, for the past and future depend on the present. The either is extra. So for next time, I'll just correct the mistakes and then post it again. Never mind now. So therefore, it's also not possible to posit an ultimately existent past and future car, for the past and future depend on the present. Okay. Further, on a subatomic level, if you go on a subatomic level, it is impossible to tell where the car starts and where it ends. Look here, these atoms, are they part of the car? If you look exactly, these little dots, there's some symbolic of the subatomic particles. Of course, we can't see them. Just to get some kind of picture of it, our sense that there's something very concrete. Okay, it's our mental consciousness, of course, that influences what our sense consciousnesses perceive. And to our sense consciousnesses, this is where the car starts and that's where it ends. In terms of time, we have a very rigid sense. That's the first moment, and then there's no more any car. It seems very clearly defined, but in actuality, as we've just heard, the present moment of the car, how do you determine that? But just in terms of the subtle particles that make up the car, I mean, where is the car? Which particles are part of the air, the oxygen that's also made of particles, the dust particles all around it, the whatever is surrounding the car. Where does the car start and where does it end? Where does your own body start and where does it end? Which particles? I mean, bits of skin are flying around, which is pretty gross, but yeah, basically we keep breathing in other people's skin particles, so it's like you're breathing in the other person, or like the atoms that are still part of our body. I mean, like, how do you clearly define this is where my body starts and this is where it ends? Very difficult. And still it feels this is my body and this is your body. Anyway, so that's about the car. But not only do all phenomena depend on their parts, they also exist in relation to other phenomena. So this is usually not mentioned as much as these parts, but it's included. A woman, for instance, is a mother in relation to her child. Okay, so a woman, when we say another person, of course, there's more than just that. There's a whole sense of who this person is. At least we see it's a woman or a man, or we see the color of the skin, or we see how tall they are and so forth. So right away, our mind perceives something more than just a person. For instance, at some point we may perceive a mother, right? To our mind, there is a mother, but this person is a mother in relation to a child, and the child is a child in relation to the mother. Okay, they depend on each other. So a woman is a mother in relation to her child. She's a daughter in relation to her parents, a sister in relation to her sibling, and so forth. Therefore, we depend on our parts, on our causes and conditions, on our parts, and as part of the parts, we also depend on other phenomena in relation to other phenomena. I'm a daughter. I'm in relation to other phenomena. I'm a nun. Okay, those are my vows. They have become part of me. But things that are not a part of me. I'm a cousin in relation to my cousin. I'm a niece in relation to my aunt. Okay, my aunt is not a part of me. And still, in relation, in dependence on my aunt, I'm a niece. In the same way here, in the case of long and short, hot and cold, here and there, I and other, the two elements of each pair, so one element long, another element short, those two are connected in such a way that they exist in relation to each other and thus depend on one another. Okay, so they depend on one another. If, however, phenomena existed the way they appear to us, inherently and so forth, a woman would be a mother or a sister without having a child or a sibling. if she was naturally, in and of herself, she were a mother, why would she need a child to be a mother, right? She would be inherent, there would be some motherness within her. Just so as we have a sense that there's a personness within this person. There's a self within me. There's a sense that I'm a daughter. It's almost like a sense there's a daughterness within me. But if I didn't have parents, if I never had parents, if we were living beings without parents, we wouldn't be daughters, we wouldn't be sons, right? But if phenomena really existed that way, a woman would be a mother or a sister without having a child or a sibling, right? Similarly, a pencil, for instance, could not be long in relation to one phenomenon and short in relation to another. Or we could not be I from our perspective and other from the perspective of someone else, right? If we were inherently, that wouldn't make sense, okay? So these are just some aspects in terms of parts, dependence on parts, and just going through it, hopefully it's clear. If not, of course, you can always send a question to Dalit about it. One thing about questions, I'm pretty sure some of you have this sense, oh, I have this question, I need to ask it right away. That's great, of course. It's great to have questions, always good to have questions. But the nature of this class makes it, first of all, a little difficult to ask questions spontaneously. Just technically, it may be a little difficult. Plus, sometimes the things that you wonder about, you have a question about, are explained anyway. And what I've learned as part of my own study is sometimes it's good to stay with that question, to deal with it yourself, maybe write it down to make sure you don't forget, and then think about it, reflect on it yourself, and see whether you can find an answer yourself, because that's sometimes much more effective than another person saying something, in my case, they may be totally wrong anyway. So therefore, if you've got a question, then, yeah, well, think about it, stay with that question. Sometimes just writing it down makes the question a little clearer. It's kind of like, I've got a question, but I'm not sure what it is. That's a very common phenomenon. And so write it down, become clear about what is it actually you're trying to ask. And then if you cannot, you've got a few days to think about it, come back to it again and again, and you don't find an answer, or you find a partial answer, but you're still left with some question, well, send an email to Dalit and ask. Okay. And it may still take some time until I answer it, but yeah, well, depending on how long it is, of course, it may not take that long. Well, of course, I'll try to answer it. Okay, anyway, going back to this here. So this is dependence on parts. Now, the most difficult types of dependence is dependence on designation by name and thought. I keep checking the time. How far did I get? Page 7. Oh, not too bad. I hope I'm not overwhelming you, but yeah, well, I'll just continue. Hopefully not overwhelming you. Okay, so designation, dependence on designation, on designating or labeling by name and thought. It's already the first word. What does it mean to designate? Impute is also a word that's used. Or label. By what? What happens? What is by what? In dependence on what? Name and thought. Okay. Is the deepest level of dependent arising. Here's just using the Tibetan and literally translating it. Okay, so although we don't really know what that means yet, at least what do we hear? What do we know about it? It's the deepest level of dependent arising. And according to the highest Buddhist school of philosophy, the Prasangika Madhyamika system, which we are studying here, fundamental wisdom, is studied from the point of view of this highest school. It is on this level that dependent arising and emptiness really connect. That's when it really, on this level, we can get a better understanding why phenomena do not exist the way they appear to us. The reason that they connect is that emptiness describes the way in which a phenomenon does not exist, whereas dependence on designation takes the same phenomenon, from an affirmative perspective, a positive or affirmative perspective, presenting the way in which it does exist on its subtlest level. Okay, so let's look at this. Dependence on designation, by name and thought, refers to the fact that a phenomenon is designated by a term. Okay, now term. It's literally saying name or term in Tibetan. Just think how you think about something. You use language. Usually you think in a certain language. In fact, and this is of course from the perspective of human beings who use language. That's what is so unique about human beings. We use language, and when we think about something, we think in a particular language. Those who are bilingual may know about this, that you can may be familiar with this, that you can actually, the more familiar you become with another language, you actually may start to think in that other language, that you're no longer thinking in Hebrew, for example, if that is your mother tongue. Instead, you start thinking in English, or I don't know, if you learn Chinese, you start thinking in Chinese. Anyway, it is still a language we use, and it's terms we use usually to think about something. But we can also think in pictures, in images. Like you think of the ocean, and instead of the word ocean appearing to your mental consciousness, it is almost like a photograph of the ocean, something more, whatever the ocean means to you, that appears to your mind. Or maybe it's like it's not just one still picture, but it's the waves kind of as they move, or someone swimming in the ocean, walking into the ocean, and so forth. So there's always something, and here it's called a term. And of course, a conceptual consciousness that thinks of the ocean, that thinks of something, right? That is the thought. It's the conceptual consciousness. And so our mind thinks something is this. It is an ocean. There is an ocean. And that is labeling. Okay? Having the thought, it's this, that, and the other. Independence on a basis of designation, which is the phenomenon's parts. Okay, let's take an example. A flower, for example, exists in dependence on a conceptual consciousness designating flower. Here, you have the thought flower. On the basis, okay, I'll show you the picture right away. Okay, there's a guy seeing a flower. There's the flower in dependence on stem, leaves, blossom. In this case here, you have stem, leaves, and blossom that are arranged in a specific way and perform particular functions. So all this is the basis of designation. On that basis, then we say the flower exists. Now it's an existent phenomenon because a conceptual consciousness labels it flower in dependence on its basis of designation. And if it was not labeled a flower, it would not be one. Okay. All right. So here, there's a flower. There's this thought, and it can be anyone, any conceptual consciousness, but it's always important to have a conceptual mind, something to name it by or designate it by. Well, it can be a word, it can be an image, anything that helps our mind to refer to what it is we're thinking of. And just thinking that, there is a flower, it is a flower. Well, that is labeling. Okay, therefore we can say, it doesn't have to be my mind, it can be any conceptual consciousness based on the basis of designation. All right, so that's really important. Another example is a $100 bill. Okay, with the flower, it seems like there's this flower over there. It's naturally grown. So it's less obvious how the flower is just labeled. Another example is a $100 bill. So due to a specific, so I keep referring to American, US dollar and so forth. It's just simpler. It's just easier to use one particular example. So before I had the United States being an independent nation as an example, here I use a $100 bill. Due to a specific quality of paper, engraving, coloring, and so forth, the United States Mint labels $100 on a piece of paper, thereby giving it a specific value. But the $100 bill does not exist from its own side, but in dependence on such a designation by name and thought. So it's a lot more obvious, like $100, it's just a piece of paper in the end, right? Okay, so first the United States Mint labels $100 and we do too. And before long, we see $100 lying on the ground and we start chasing it, right? Oh, $100. Yes, we label it. And conventionally, of course, we can use it. It exists, but not from its own side, not in and of itself. It's not like, it seems like the $100 are saying, pick me up, be quick before someone else does, right? There's this sense, very difficult to pinpoint, that there's something from the side of the object. All right, so this is how far I want to go today. I've really stretched it here, but let me just repeat. Let me just say, and more needs to be said. This is the most difficult one, dependence on designation by name and thought. But let's just leave it for now and do our meditation on what we've learned so far. So what did we learn? Phenomena cannot exist in and of themselves because they're dependent on other phenomena. For instance, causes and conditions. All right, if they're impermanent, that's true for impermanent phenomena. So they depend on causes and conditions. Therefore, they cannot exist naturally as this, that, and the other, because they depend on something. If they were naturally in and of itself this, that, and the other, they would just be and wouldn't need anything. But they need other causes and conditions. And even if we consider that and we accept that, well, then it's also difficult to pinpoint. We go closer and look at this, despite knowing that phenomena exist and dependence on causes and conditions. But when is the exact moment something actually comes into existence? Very difficult to define. And then there's dependence on parts. Okay, the things are dependent on their parts. But then when we use this understanding and we look deeper, where's the phenomenon? Well, just as we couldn't pinpoint a fast moment of something, or in the case of the car, fast moment, very difficult, we can't pinpoint a present moment or any car within its parts. Okay. And then lastly, we have dependence on designation by name and thought. Okay, you hear already where it's going to. So the flower is just called a flower. There's no flowerness found from the side of the object. The $100, where's the value of the $100? Well, doesn't exist from the side of the object. Okay, anyway, this is how far I want to do this today. And now we've got 15 minutes, maybe a little less, to meditate on this. So I'll stop sharing the screen and then we can do some meditation. Okay, so as usual, we start with some breathing meditation. Just focus on your breath. And then I guide you through the meditation. And of course, as you're aware by now, at the very end, I always ask you to take a moment to focus on whatever conclusion you've come to on the basis of your reflection, some kind of conclusion, some insight possibly. Focus on that single-pointedly and just allow for it to kind of sink deeper onto a deeper level of your mind. Okay, so let's start. Phenomena, the way they appear to us, as inherent, objectively existent. Well, that's impossible. because that would mean that they're by their very nature a flower or a car or a self. Without depending on anything else. There's nothing that does not depend on numerous other phenomena. Or permanent phenomena depend on their causes and conditions. Classic example of a sprout that appears so concrete, so objective to our mind. While it has arisen, has come into existence in dependence on a seed, just its main cause. And conditions such as water, fertilizer, warmth, oxygen, and so forth. And if we go a little deeper, well, if the sprout has arisen from its causes and conditions, when was that very first moment? When is it no longer a seed, but a sprout? And is there a precise first moment? How could there be? Every moment can be subdivided into smaller moments in time. Likewise, anything that exists is dependent on its parts. A car, for instance, is made up of endless parts that occupy space, such as its engine, its doors, its tires, steering wheel, and so forth. It's made up of moments in time. Car this morning, car in the afternoon, car in the evening. So it's made of temporary parts or moments in time. And of course, it's got attributes such as its size, its color, it has functions, performs the function of moving from one place to another, which are part of the car. So where's the car? Among its parts, obviously, but even though it appears so concretely to our mind, when we take it apart, where's the car? In fact, we can take it apart endlessly. And always ever find something that is not a car, but just a part of it. And with respect to its temporal parts or its moments, well, we can't see the past car and we can't see the future car, but we have a strong sense that we can see the present car. Where's that present moment? It is a continuum in time. which consists of a former moment, a later moment, and a middling moment. And each of these moments can be divided into even shorter moments. So there's no concrete present moment of the car. And of course, the sprout, the car, we ourselves, and whatever else exists is dependent on designation by name and thought. Taking a $100 bill, for instance, of course, it depends on causes and conditions and on parts. It's also labeled by the US Mint, labeling it $100. Designating a certain value. On that piece of paper. Without that value findable or existing inherent, or objectively from the side of the object. And now to conclude, spend a few moments single-pointedly focusing on whatever insight you've gained through this analysis. And internalize it further. And then let's dedicate whatever positive potential we've accumulated together here. First, of course, towards our own enlightenment, not for our own benefit, but for the benefit of all sentient beings. And let's also think, right, this positive potential cause our lamas, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama and all the other great spiritual masters, to have an extremely long life, so that they can continue to inspire and guide us for a long time to come. It may also help us, or it may help beings around us we're closely connected to help them with their problems, to overcome their problems. May Geshe Punsok and Tali Lubin soon recover completely. And may our virtue help in other ways to bring more peace to this world. So with this in mind, let's recite the dedication prayer and reflect on its meaning. Through the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings, without exception, into that enlightened state. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. May the precious Bodhi mind not yet born arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. Okay, thank you very much. I almost made it in time, but again, I didn't, so 5 minutes longer. Just to remind you, please focus on these 4 aspects of freedom that I mentioned earlier, that we're born at a time and a place where we have access to the Dharma, we especially mentally have the capacity to study the Dharma, reflect on the Dharma, and so forth. What was the last point? Forget the last one now. Anyway, and then the 4th one, reflect on that as well, together with what you've learned today. And well, if you also have the time to read the material in advance, we'll post it at the weekend. Okay, great. Have a lovely week. And yeah, see you again next week.
Thank you, Geshe.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Geshe Ma. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, DFI.